Welcome to the Spook Zone. We're still in the process of unpacking in our new flat that is all ours. Hooray! In the session with us today are Jamie and Ellie. Which one is talking? Who knows? But Ellie had this whole script set up, and then she started to switch out. Something alarmed her. And whatcha? Dissociation! For context, we are in a 32-year-old body, so we grew up in the 90s and the noughties. The first representation we came across, accidental representation. When we were growing up, as a system, we would sometimes come across media or a book or a story or something like that that we just felt connected to. And it's interesting that the things we felt so connected to ended up being accidental system representation, which is, pretty cool. So, representation in the 90s. The first representation we came across was the store. Well, first of all, trigger warning for religion. But the first representation we ever had as children was actually Legion in the Bible. But not the actual Bible, as Ellie was remembering. We had a children's version of the Bible that we would read as children, so we were pretty young. I don't know when we first read the story, to be honest. I don't remember when, but so the story, I don't know if we can find it online. It's Sunday, so we can't go to the Mormon shops. We were raised very Mormon, and they had children's scriptures, and inside those children's scriptures was the story of Legion. And that was our favorite Bible story. That was our, literally one of our favorite Bible stories was Legion. So for those who don't know, the story of Legion is basically Jesus comes across this crazy man who, basically very mentally ill man. So he comes across this very mentally ill man, and it turns out that this man has multiple devils inside of him, and they all call themselves Legion. So Jesus is casting out all of these devils into the pigs, and then they fall down into the ocean or a lake or something, and they all drown, basically. So you gotta remember, when you're a kid in the 90s, it was the 90s. I don't think anyone will get that reference. But as a kid in the 90s with no representation and not knowing anything about mental health in general, let alone DID, that was one of the things that we felt a pull towards. So yeah, that was the first one, and that's all I'm going to say about that, because it kind of freaks me out. I mean, I still get a feeling of connection toward that story, because it was something to relate to. We didn't really know why it was relatable or anything, but it's one of those things that you look back later and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense why I liked that, why that was our favorite Bible story. Can I speak English, please? The next thing, I mean, you could maybe count Power Rangers, but we never felt connected to Power Rangers. There's 5 people, and they each control a part of the big giant robot's body, and then they have to work together as a team. I mean, it's kind of system-like, but we never saw it like that, and we also really didn't get into Power Rangers till we were older, when we were teenagers. SPD Emergency, that one was great. That was the best. And actually, okay, so looking back at Power Rangers SPD, which came out in the 2000s at some point. I don't remember what year, but there was a character named Zoe, I want to say. She was the Yellow Ranger, And she had this power where she could split into multiple selves, and these selves could be either incorporeal or corporeal based on what they needed at the time. And I actually didn't remember any of this until Jordan started rewatching the series. I think it was Jordan. So there was that, but that didn't affect us as much. Oh, and then there was another one that we sort of forgot about. Another representation that we came across as kids, and this one kind of hit us in the feels, but it also was kind of a lot like strange to us and alarming. There was a little cartoon called Little Nemo, and we're not talking Finding Nemo, we're talking Little Nemo, Nightmare in Slumberland. It was this old cartoon that was freaking terrifying, to be honest. But there's this characters where they are like 3 or 4 or 5 little goblins, but they can mush together and create a big goblin. And I remember someone being a little put off by that, but we've always been a little bit iffy about that whole becoming one sort of a thing, which we'll get into later. Another representation we actually found, was it in college that we read that? Well, if we did, I won't remember when, because I don't remember college very much. But we actually unironically read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We actually saw it first, the story itself first, in The Page Master, which was another cartoon from the 90s. I think it starred Macaulay Culkin. Yeah. And they had like a simplified version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So that's where we came across the story first, and probably a billion other places. Probably Wishbone had an episode on it. I know they had an episode on Frankenstein that we watched and all that. But yeah, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So you can tell the kind of, the kind of accidental rep. You got a so-called crazy man who's possessed by a bunch of devils. You've got a couple of kid shows that are pretty okay, but didn't quite hit the mark at the time for us. And then, wait, what was the next one I talked about? Oh, and then Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where Mr. Hyde goes around and murders people and enjoys it. And also they split as an adult because due to a chemical substance, all Marvel style. So just great. So imagine you know nothing about being a system, and that's what you relate to. Yeah. Another representation. Okay. A big deal for us was actually a manga of a popular video game series. I know these days the most popular part of that video game series is Breath of the Wild, but we were fans of it all the way since 1998. A game came out called The Legend of Zelda Four Swords, and that was in like the 2003, 4, 5-ish range. And we'd played the earlier games, but this one in particular, Legend of Zelda Four Swords, came. They hired someone to create a manga, and it's wonderful, and we love it. It's one of our favorites. And basically, the hero is split into 4 parts of himself, basically, and they each have their own personalities, and they pick names based on the colors they're wearing so that they can differentiate each other, and they have to work together and everything. And I say they split into 4, but the truth is there's 5, but that's the twist. Spoilers. It's like 20 years old. But like, reason this one was so groundbreaking, I think for us, or at least Ellie was surmising this, is because there's a character who is, the dark side, kind of like in Jekyll and Hyde or whatever. There's the dark part of the self or whatever, but in this one, it ends up, spoiler alert, where Shadow becomes a good guy, where he's just basically misunderstood, doesn't get his needs met or whatever. He does some bad things and then he turns around and it ends up that he's the one who saves the day in the end anyways. So I think that was groundbreaking because it was the first time we'd seen a dark side character who turned out good in the end. Where it was just like, it wasn't a stereotype of, oh, the dark side of the human soul, which we don't believe in. So that was a really big deal. Other than that, I'm trying to think of more representation, and to be honest with you, I know Ellie had, damn it, I wish she'd gotten to write it. But we became big fans of Four Swords. We wrote a fan fiction, about like Vio and Shadow's like friendship and everything and how that went through. So it was important because it showed a different view, and this one hit us. Like we became serious fans of this, and like this is one of those things where we were obsessed with it, and we couldn't help being obsessed with Four Swords. And we were obsessed with Four Swords for years. We wrote so many like fan fictions, and then we also wrote original stories that were based on the idea of Four Swords. And another thing that's interesting for us is at the end, all of the links combine into one link at the very end, and I remember that feeling very sad to us. Like we hated that ending. We never considered it canon. We were like, nah, stupid. And it makes sense because even now, that's like Final Fusion is not something we're headed towards anytime ever. Like ever. Obviously, we've thought about it. We think about it because, we're interested in healing and whatnot, and we'll take any option seriously enough to consider it. Any serious option, I should say, but it never felt right. Well, and especially at the time, it definitely wouldn't have been right because we weren't fused, we weren't integrated at all back then. So the idea that all of us would just merge into one felt wrong, and I don't think that really has anything to do with us wanting fusion or not wanting fusion, whether now or in the future. In the past, it just wasn't a thing, and of course it would be sad because that would mean that we wouldn't actually be listening to each of our parts or anything. And also, I mean, come on, it's more fun with the links separate. We could go on and on about Four Swords for like 500,000 years. Like, look at this cute little guy. Look at him with the purple hair and the blue eyes, and then look at them. They're so cute. Like, I can't even. They're my favorite. There was also, in Ocarina of Time Zelda, which came out in 1998, there was Dark Link, but that Dark Link never really had a personality. People wrote fan fictions and gave him a personality, us included. But it was just a little gimmick. He wasn't actually a character who had a personality or anything. He was just a mirror image of Link with no soul or anything that tried to beat him up, basically. That doesn't really count as accidental rep, except, I mean, it kind of is. Oh! More recently, and, there's a few things. Ellie was actually surprised to learn that there was more representation, like Moon Knight, obviously, which is a good one. There's a few more that we've heard of that we haven't tried. We haven't watched United States of Terra, and we've watched a little bit of Mr. Robot, which we like, but it's pretty dark and gritty, and I don't know how. And I've only seen like half the first season, so I can't. And it's very adult too, like very 18 plus situations and stuff. So so I don't know. There's things about it that are relatable, and it's more like it's not really the story is not really about the DID, at least so far. It's just there happens to be a character who happens to be the main character who has DID, and I kind of like that approach. I think that's kind of cool. But Ellie hasn't watched it, so I don't think she would have anything to say about it. And then we've also heard about so like that's those were both actual reps. So Mr. Robot and Moon Knight are both like actual DID representation, as far as I know. Another accidental rep though that I hear is super popular with the younger generation. It's so funny to say that. Is the Steven Universe. Is it the Steven Universe? No, it's just Steven Universe, right? My age is showing. Apparently, they have like gem fusions where the characters fuse into a new character and then they unfuse, and that's a thing that can happen in systems for sure. And they use it to explain that quite a bit. So I think that's there's a lot more representation these days for younger people than there was in my age. It makes sense that people who grew up like I did wouldn't have figured out their DID until they were older or in a therapist's office. It makes sense. But nowadays, I just don't see that being as true anymore. I think there's a stigma against like discovering your system without help of a doctor, and I think it's kind of ridiculous because there's so much more representation out there, and whether people want to believe it or not, there was representation in the past, and those of us that lived back then, some of us found it. Some of us found it, and it's really not far fetched that people are gonna start figuring out their system a lot earlier. Like, I mean, I didn't have the internet, and I still found things. I'm not sure what else we were gonna say. I think we might have. We're gonna say, um, like for us, the representation, like I said, it was people who were possessed, or people who had were out murdering and stuff like that. We hear a lot of people who are very scared of or sad of the diagnosis, and that just it wasn't the case for me because I grew up in a what do you call it? I grew up very uneducated about mental health. I grew up very uneducated about mental health, and also in a very religious, I would say fanatic religious way. So for me, I got to the point where I was okay with the idea that I might discover that I was actually a murderer or some kind of abuser or something. I didn't care. What I wanted was to find out and figure out how to take accountability and change and do something about it. So when I found out that DID wasn't actually any of those things, it wasn't possession, it wasn't like insanity, it wasn't something dangerous or anything like that, I was relieved. I mean, I was ready to accept the worst of the worst case stuff. So to me, yeah, life was scary. Things about DID are scary, but I'm not a murderer, so that's a plus. And I know that probably seems pretty extreme to say, but again, that's the representation that existed back in the 90s. I know we want to pretend that, oh, we're so forward thinking and da 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 da. And we don't want to, and things aren't that great right now. They're really not. But it was, I'm just gonna say different. I'm not gonna say worse. It was different. It was way different, and there was no internet. There were no YouTubers. There were no websites. Good luck finding this in a library. There was nothing. For me, there was nothing but Legion. For me and for anyone else, like in my system. Like they didn't find, like I wasn't out all the time in childhood, and they didn't find anything either. There was nothing but a Bible folk tale and Jekyll and Hyde. And Pagemaster, which was Jekyll and Hyde. Was there any kind of story that you watched pre-discovery or pre-diagnosis where you were like, wow, this, I've really connected to this. I'm not entirely sure why. It feels like I'm like almost compelled to read this thing and consume this media and I can't stop myself. Let us know in the comments down below. Okay, now I need to do an outro. Welcome to the Freak Song.